Somewhere in the hill country of Middle Tennessee, a property changed hands 4 times between 1884 and 1903. At the Rutherford County Courthouse, every recorded deed includes the same unusual addition: a single handwritten clause, copied word for word from one transaction to the next, as if whoever wrote it was unwilling to alter even a syllable. It states, "The cabin at the eastern edge of the property is to remain secured. No inquiry shall be made of its contents. No entry is to be attempted. 4 different owners, 4 different lawyers, and not one of them asked why." For 19 years, that cabin stood with its door bolted from the outside, its lone window boarded with planks so thick they must have been cut specifically for that purpose. The neighbors knew it was there. The children playing in the surrounding fields knew it was there. And every single one of them had been taught, from the time they were old enough to listen, that some things are better left alone. Then, in the autumn of 1903, a family arrived from Cincinnati who had never learned that lesson. They had no history with that land, no memory of what the county had quietly and collectively agreed to forget. When they asked about the cabin, asked in that easy, cheerful way of people with no reason to be afraid, the silence that answered them was so complete, so immediate, and so unanimous that even they felt it. They opened the cabin anyway. What they found inside would not be understood for another decade. And when it finally was understood, several people who had lived in that county their entire lives refused to speak of it for the rest of theirs. Before we continue with the story of the Hargrove property and what was hidden inside that locked cabin for 19 years, if you're new to this channel, welcome. We tell stories here that history tried to bury. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our listeners are. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what was in that cabin, you have to understand what happened on that land long before the door was ever bolted shut. The property had been known since at least the 1830s as the Tatum Place. Elias Tatum cleared the land himself, working alongside the 8 enslaved people he had brought from Georgia when he moved his family to Tennessee's Central Basin in 1831. By the standards of his time and place, he was not a wealthy man, not a grand planter, not someone with a columned house and hundreds of acres, but he was prosperous enough to have acquired human beings as property and prosperous enough to keep them. The Tatum land sat on roughly 240 acres of mixed timber and bottomland near the Stones River, where the soil was dark and yielding, and the summers were long enough to grow tobacco and corn in quantities that kept a household fed, and a debt ledger mostly in the black. The county itself, Rutherford, was already well established by the time Elias arrived. The town of Murfreesboro had been incorporated in 1817, bringing with it the infrastructure of a place that considered itself permanent: a courthouse, a post road, several churches of different denominations, and the particular social architecture that comes with a community that has collectively decided what it values and what it does not. What Rutherford County valued in 1831 was order. What it did not value, or rather, what it had learned to carefully not see, was the machinery required to maintain that order. Elias Tatum's 8 enslaved workers lived in 3 cabins behind the main house, separated from it by a kitchen garden and a woodpile. The easternmost of those cabins, the one farthest from the main house and closest to the tree line, was the smallest. According to county records, it had been built in 1833, 2 years after the others, and it had been built differently. The walls were thicker. The window was smaller and set high. And unlike the other cabins, its door hinges were mounted on the outside so that the door, when locked, was locked from without, None of this was unusual enough in 1833 to merit comment. Elias Tatum died in 1849, leaving the property to his eldest son, Cornelius, who was 27 at the time and had grown up on that land. Cornelius inherited not only the property and its debts, but also the 7 enslaved people still living there. Since one had died in the interim. Whatever understanding he had developed over the course of his childhood of how that land functioned. He had watched his father. He knew the routines. He stepped into managing the property with the ease of a man who has been rehearsing a role his entire life, without quite realizing it. By 1855, Cornelius Tatum was running the property with 9 enslaved workers, having acquired 2 more through a transaction, with a neighbor settling debts. He had also married a woman named Dorinda Prout, the daughter of a preacher from Smyrna, who brought to the marriage a deep and apparently sincere religiosity and a habit of recording things in journals. It is Dorinda's journals, 3 of them, discovered in a trunk at the Murfreesboro Public Library in 1914, that provide the most detailed account we have of life on the Tatum property in the years before the war. She wrote about her garden. She wrote about her children, 3 of them born between 1856 and 1861. She wrote about the weather with a specificity that suggested someone who understood that weather governed everything in a farming household: the planting, the harvest, the travel, the health of animals and people alike. And occasionally, tucked between entries about scripture and household management, she wrote about the Eastern cabin. Not often, not with any apparent alarm, but she wrote about it. The first mention appears in an entry dated March 1857. Cornelius has moved Amos to the East cabin alone. He says it is necessary for the management of the others. I did not ask further. The second mention is from July of the same year. The East cabin is kept locked at night now. Cornelius carries the key himself. I have not seen Amos at the communal meals in some weeks. Eliza brings food to the door. Then, nothing for almost 2 years. The third mention is from January 1859, and it is different in tone. Dorinda's handwriting, usually neat and consistent, becomes erratic in this entry, the letters pressing harder into the page, as though she is fighting something as she writes. She does not explain what she observed. She does not describe what she found when, apparently, she approached the Eastern cabin on her own one morning while Cornelius was away at the market in Murfreesboro. She writes only this: I understand now why the window was placed where it is. I understand now what the lock is for. God forgive this house. And then the subject does not appear again for another 18 months. To read Dorinda Tatum's journals in sequence is to experience the particular horror of a woman who has made a decision about what she will and will not permit herself to know. She was not ignorant. She was educated, literate, and clearly capable of sustained moral reflection. Her entries on scripture are thoughtful and sometimes startlingly nuanced. But she had also married into a system and lived inside it. The cost of truly seeing that system was a cost she appears to have decided she could not pay. So she looked away. The East cabin stayed locked, and Amos, whoever he had been before March 1857, disappeared entirely from the written record of the Tatum household. The Civil War arrived in Rutherford County with a force that surprised even those who had been anticipating it. The Battle of Stones River, fought at the very end of December 1862 and into the first days of January 1863, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire conflict. Nearly 13,000 Union casualties, more than 10,000 Confederate. All of them on ground that Rutherford County families had farmed and walked and been buried in for decades. The sound of that battle could be heard for miles. The wounded were brought into Murfreesboro in numbers that overwhelmed every available structure: churches, the courthouse, private homes. Cornelius Tatum was not a soldier. He was 39 years old in 1862, and whatever exemptions or arrangements he had made to avoid conscription, he was on his property when the armies moved through. He had sent Dorinda and the children to her father's house in Smyrna at the first sign of Union troop movements, and he had stayed behind to protect, as he put it in a letter to his brother-in-law. What is mine? What happened on the Tatham property during those weeks in December and January is reconstructed from three sources: a deposition given by a Union soldier named Corporal Frederick Osterhaus, who passed through the area in early January 1863, a letter Cornelius wrote to his wife on January 9th of that year, and an account recorded by a freedman named Solomon Gentry in 1871 as part of a labor dispute documentation in Nashville. Corporal Osterhaus noted in his deposition that his unit had camped briefly on or near the Tatham property on the night of January 4th. They observed a structure at the eastern edge of the farmyard, a small cabin, heavily built, with a bolted door, and from inside it they heard a sound he described as a voice, though not speaking in any way I could make out. More like something between a man singing to himself and a man talking to himself that's been doing it so long he's forgotten there's a difference. He wrote that they did not open the cabin. They had orders to keep moving. Cornelius' letter to Dorinda, written 5 days later, makes no mention of Union soldiers on the property. It is taken up almost entirely with the condition of the livestock and the state of the outbuildings after what he calls the disturbances of last week. Near the end of the letter, in a passage that seems added almost as an afterthought, he writes, "The situation with Amos has resolved itself. There is no need to discuss it further when you return." Solomon Gentry's account, recorded 8 years later in the context of a labor dispute that had nothing directly to do with the Tatham property, contains a single passage that seems to refer to these events. Gentry had worked on a neighboring property before and after the war, and he had known some of the people from the Tatham household. He wrote, or rather dictated, since the account was transcribed by a Nashville clerk, that in the first week of January 1863, a man came out of the woods on the eastern side of the Tatham place and walked through 3 fields before anyone saw him. He could not say his own name when they asked him. He had been in that place, the small one with the thick walls, since before the cold came. Nobody counted how long. When they asked him questions, he answered, but the answers did not fit the questions. He was like a man who has been keeping time in a way that doesn't match the clock everyone else is using. Gentry does not name this man. He does not explain what happened to him afterward. The account moves on to other matters, and the passage sits there, in the middle of a labor document, like something that wandered in from a different story. It is the only surviving first-hand account that might, if you read it carefully enough, describe Amos walking out of the east cabin during the chaos of the battle's aftermath. Or it might describe someone else entirely. The documents do not resolve this question. They only raise it and then fall silent, the way documents from that era often do when they brush up against something that the people keeping them had decided, collectively, not to record. Cornelius Tatham survived the war, but his property survived it less well. The tobacco fields had been largely disrupted. Fences were down across much of the acreage, and the labor arrangements that had sustained the farm were, with emancipation, dissolved entirely. Several of the people who had been enslaved on the Tatham property left immediately. A few remained for wages that Cornelius could not consistently pay. Dorinda returned from Smyrna in the spring of 1863 with the children and resumed her journals. She wrote about the difficulty of the Reconstruction period, with the same careful attention she had brought to everything else. The practical challenges, the changed social landscape, the bewildering new arrangements of a world that had been, as she put it, turned on its face and set back down, and nothing is where it was before. She does not mention Amos again, and she does not mention the East Cabin again by name, but in an entry from September 1863, she writes something that scholars have found difficult to contextualize. Cornelius has begun to use the East Cabin for storage. Tobacco tools, mainly. He changed the door hardware last month. I do not know why I find this significant. Perhaps because I have spent 6 years not looking at that door, and now every time I cross the yard, I look at it without meaning to. The East Cabin, then, became a storage shed. The property limped through reconstruction, losing acreage as debts came due, selling parcels to neighbors and eventually to a land company that was consolidating farmland in the area. By 1875, the Tathams held only about 60 acres of the original 240. Cornelius died in 1877 of a lung ailment that had been worsening for years. Dorinda sold the remaining property the following year and moved to Murfreesboro proper to live with her eldest daughter. The property passed to a man named Warren Gillespie, who had come to Rutherford County from Virginia after the war and built a modest business trading in farm equipment and seed. He was not a farmer himself. He leased the fields to tenant families and maintained the main house primarily as a residence. He was the first owner of the property who had no living memory of the Tatham household, and therefore no particular reason to regard the East Cabin with any specific attention. But he still did not open it. This is the detail that becomes harder to explain as you move further from the war and its immediate context. Gillespie did not open the East Cabin, and the family that purchased the property from Gillespie's estate in 1889, a couple named Holt, originally from North Carolina, did not open it. The deed both times contained the handwritten addendums. The cabin is to remain secured. No inquiry is to be made. Where did that language originate? Gillespie would have needed to consult someone local when he purchased the property. A lawyer, a neighbor, someone familiar with the county and its arrangements. Someone told him about the clause. Someone explained, however obliquely, why it existed, and he accepted it. He did not push. He did not ask. There is something telling in this. Not that people kept the cabin locked. That is explicable in any number of ways, but that each successive owner accepted the clause without apparent resistance, without documented curiosity. That suggests that the explanation they were given was sufficient, that whoever told them about the cabin told them enough to make them understand that opening it was not worth whatever they might find. What were they told? That question is unanswerable from the documents alone. But it is the question that the new family, arriving from Cincinnati in October 1903, did not know to ask. Their name was Pemberton. Arthur Pemberton was 34 years old, a bookkeeper by trade, who had decided, with the particular optimism of a man who has spent his adult life behind a ledger and has begun to feel the walls closing in, that he wanted to try farming. His wife, Catherine, was 31 and had grown up on a farm in Indiana, with mixed feelings about returning to one that she kept largely to herself. They had 2 children, a boy named Edmund, 9, and a girl named Vera, 6. They had purchased the property, sight mostly unseen, through a land agent in Nashville, who had described it as a fine Middle Tennessee farm, with solid improvements and excellent soil. The price was favorable. Arthur took this as a sign of opportunity rather than, as perhaps it should have been, a reason for curiosity. They arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the leaves on the surrounding hills were full in their color, and the air had that particular quality of Tennessee autumn. Cool in the mornings, warm by afternoon. the light coming in at an angle that makes everything look as though it's being observed, rather than simply existing. Catherine stood in the farmyard, looked at the house, the outbuildings, the fields, and said that it was beautiful. Arthur agreed. Edmund immediately ran toward the tree line to see what was there. It was Edmund who found the east cabin first. He came back to where his parents were unloading the wagon and reported that there was a little building at the edge of the yard, back toward the trees, with boards over its window and a very big, very old-looking lock on the door. Arthur walked over to look at it. He examined the lock, indeed old, a heavy iron padlock of a design that had not been manufactured in at least 30 years. He examined the door and the boards over the window. He walked around the structure once, noting the thickness of the walls and the quality of the construction. Then he went back to unloading the wagon. That evening, after the children were in bed, he mentioned it to Catherine. She asked if the land agent had said anything about a storage cabin at the east side of the property. Arthur said he didn't recall that it had come up. She said someone must have the key, then, or they'd have to cut the lock. Arthur agreed and said he'd ask around in town the following week. He asked around in town the following week. The response he received was not hostile, not dramatic, quite polite, in fact. The hardware store owner said he wasn't sure who might have the key to that particular lock. The postmaster said he didn't know much about the property's history. Two neighbors encountered in the street said they weren't familiar with the details of the outbuildings over there. A woman at the dry goods counter said pleasantly that some things on old properties are best left to settle themselves. Arthur Pemberton was from Cincinnati. He had been raised in a city where the past was something that happened elsewhere. In other people's families, in other places, he was not attuned to the particular frequency of a community that has made a collective decision to not know something. He heard the vagueness in what people said to him and attributed it to the natural reticence of rural Tennesseans toward newcomers. He did not hear the agreement underneath it. He went back to the property and cut the lock. He used a cold chisel and a hammer from the toolbox he'd brought from Cincinnati, and he worked at it for the better part of an hour, because the iron was old and dense and had not been designed to yield to anything. Catherine stood a few yards back, watching. Edmund and Vera had been sent to occupy themselves in the front of the house, away from the east yard. The morning was overcast. The light flat and gray, the trees at the edge of the property already stripped of most of their leaves. When the lock finally gave, Arthur pulled the door open. The smell that came out was old, enclosed, and complex. Wood and earth, and something else, something Catherine, who had grown up on a farm, recognized without quite being able to name immediately. It was the smell of long habitation in a small space. Not decay. Nothing dead. It was the smell of a place where someone had lived. Arthur stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. The cabin was about 12 feet by 14 feet. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth. The walls were bare logs, the chinking between them dried and cracked in several places. High on the eastern wall, just below the roof line, was the single window, its board still in place. The light that came through the gaps in the boards was thin, falling in stripes across the floor. Along the south wall was a plank shelf. On the shelf were objects: a tin cup, badly rusted, a piece of rag, unrecognizable as anything specific, a small wooden implement of uncertain purpose, hand-carved, worn smooth with handling. And on the wall beside the shelf, scratched deep into the wood of the log itself, were marks, arranged in groups, in a counting pattern. The kind of marks a person makes when keeping track of days. Arthur Pemberton stood in the east cabin for a long time, looking at those marks. He was a bookkeeper. He counted things for a living. He counted the marks. There were, depending on how you grouped them, somewhere between 480 and 520 days' worth, approximately 16 to 17 months. He came out of the cabin and looked at his wife. She was watching him from where she stood in the yard, her arms folded against the October chill. She could tell from his face that something was wrong. She asked what was in there. He said it used to be where someone lived. She asked who. He said he didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and began to write down questions, not answers. He had no answers yet, just questions. In the careful, organized way of a man who has spent his working life making sense of numbers and what they represent. Who had been kept in that cabin? And why? For how long? Who had authorized it? Who had maintained it? And who, after everything that had apparently happened there, had decided that the door should be locked from the outside and not opened again? The questions covered 2 pages. He folded them and put them in his coat pocket, then went to bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the bare trees at the eastern edge of the property, coming from the direction of the cabin, whose door now stood open for the first time in 19 years. It was not difficult for Arthur Pemberton to locate the county records. He was systematic and patient. The Rutherford County Courthouse, rebuilt after substantial war damage, maintained reasonably organized deed and property records, going back to the county's founding. What he found there, over several visits across November and December 1903, was a paper trail illuminating in its outlines, but maddening in its gaps. He found the succession of property sales, each with a clause about the cabin. He found Cornelius Tadham's name and his father Elias's name, and the dates of their respective deaths. He found the assessment records from before the war, which listed the enslaved people on the property by first name only, as was standard. Names recorded not as people but as property values, each followed by an age and an approximate dollar amount. In the 1840 and 1845 assessments, among the names was Amos, listed as a male approximately 30 years of age in 1840, valued at $650. In the 1850 and 1855 assessments, Amos appeared again. In the 1860 assessment, the last one conducted before emancipation changed everything, Amos was not listed. He had been removed from the inventory before the war. That fit, more or less, with what the documents suggested about his removal to the East Cabin around 1857. But it raised a new question. What was the official explanation for his absence from the 1860 inventory? Had he been sold? Had he died? Had someone simply chosen not to include him? Arthur found no record of a sale. He found no death record, though death records for enslaved people in this period were kept inconsistently at best. He found nothing that explained Amos's absence from the 1860 records, except the absence itself. He went back to the cabin. He stood inside it and looked again at the marks on the wall. He had brought a candle this time, and he moved it slowly along the counting marks, examining them more carefully than he had the first time. They were arranged in the standard grouping, 4 vertical marks crossed by a diagonal, that people use when counting in 5s. The groups were regular for most of the wall, but near the end, the groupings became irregular. Some were incomplete. Some were made more deeply than the others, as though the person making them had pressed harder or had come back to reinforce a mark already made. And then at the very end of the sequence, there was a section where the marks stopped being groups at all and became something harder to categorize. Not random, but not the counting pattern either. Shapes, angles, something that might, if you looked at it in the right light and let your eyes find what they were looking for, resemble attempts at letters. Arthur could not read them as letters. He traced them with his finger, trying to find shapes he recognized. He came back 3 times over the following week and tried again. He could not say with certainty what they were. He copied them as carefully as he could into his notebook, carried that notebook home, and sat with it for a long time. Catherine watched him doing this. She had not been back to the east cabin since the morning they opened it. She had gone in once briefly, while Arthur was still inside that first day, and she had seen the shelf and the tin cup and the marks on the wall, and she had come back out into the gray October morning and stood in the yard looking at the tree line for a while. She was an Indiana farm girl, which meant she was not easily unsettled by hard history. But she was also the mother of 2 children who were running and playing on land that had, it now appeared, been the site of something she did not fully understand yet and was not sure she wanted to. She asked Arthur one evening what he thought the marks meant. He said he thought they meant that someone had been in that cabin without the ability to leave for somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years. She asked if he thought it was the man in the assessment records, the one named Amos. He said he thought it was likely. She said, and when he came out, what happened to him? Arthur had no answer for that. He had found no record of Amos after the 1855 assessment. He had found no record of what the Tathams had done with or about him after emancipation, if he was still alive by then. He had found no grave record, no Freedmen's Bureau documentation with that name, nothing in the Nashville records that Gentry's account pointed toward. He said, I don't know, but I'd like to find out, she said. I know you would. And then she said something that Arthur recorded years later, as the sentence that stayed with him longest from that whole period. I want to know too, but I think we should be ready for the possibility that we're not going to find a good ending to this. Arthur went to Nashville in January 1904. He spent 4 days in the records offices there, working through Freedmen's Bureau documentation, labor records, church records from the African Methodist Episcopal churches in Middle Tennessee, county-level records from surrounding counties. He was looking for an Amos, formerly enslaved from Rutherford County, in his 50s or 60s by 1865 or later, and he did not find him. What he found instead changed the shape of what he thought he was looking for. In the Nashville offices of what had been the Regional Freedmen's Bureau, Arthur came across a collection of claim documents from 1866 and 1867, records of formerly enslaved people making claims for back wages, for property they'd been promised, for various forms of support that the Bureau had been charged, however inadequately, with providing. Most of the documents were routine. The desperate bureaucratic records of people trying to establish a foothold in a world that had just technically acknowledged their humanity, while doing very little to practically support it. But buried in the middle of a folder of Rutherford County documents was a claim not from Amos himself, but from a woman named Hester Gaines, who identified herself as formerly enslaved on a property in Rutherford County, Tennessee. Her claim was for wages owed by the estate of Cornelius Tatham. At the bottom of her claim form, in the space provided for additional information, she had written, or had dictated, with someone writing for her, a single sentence that she apparently felt was relevant to her case. There is a man who was on that property who was not freed with the others, and I do not know if he is alive. His name is Amos Jaybird. Someone should look for him. Amos Jaybird, not just Amos, a surname, or rather, the kind of name that enslaved people sometimes carried as a form of identity that existed outside the records kept by the people who owned them. A name that meant something to Hester Gaines, who had known him. A name that meant he was a person with a history that extended before and beyond his captivity. Arthur Pemberton sat in the Nashville Records office with that document in his hands and felt something shift in his understanding of what he had found in that east cabin. He had been thinking of it as a mystery, an old, troubling mystery, but a historical one. Something that had happened and been resolved one way or another in the distant past. The kind of thing that leaves marks on walls and then is over. But Hester Gaines's 1866 notation suggested it had not been resolved, that there had been someone in 1866, a year after the war ended, who was still asking about Amos Jaybird, who had made an official claim in the records of a government bureau, in the hope that someone would look for him. Whether anyone had looked, Arthur could not determine. There was no follow-up document in the folder, no resolution. Just Hester's sentence sitting there in the Freedmen's Bureau records for 38 years, unanswered. If you've been with us this long into this story, you already understand why nobody wanted to talk to the Pembertons about that cabin. Leave a like if this is hitting you the way we think it is, and share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, because what Arthur found next, in the records he hadn't thought to check yet, is the part that changes everything. The key to what happened, the mechanism of it, the specific human decisions that produced that east cabin and what it contained, came not from the grand repositories of Nashville, but from the basement of the Murfreesboro Methodist Church, where a deacon named Cyrus Ledbetter had, for reasons he himself apparently could not fully explain, preserved a collection of correspondence and personal documents belonging to several local families. He had gathered them after the war, during the period of displacement and upheaval, when households were dissolving and their contents being scattered, and he had put them in wooden boxes and kept them in the church basement because, he told Arthur when Arthur tracked him down in the spring of 1904, he felt that papers about what happened here should stay here, whatever they say. The Cyrus Ledbetter was 71 years old. He had been born in Rutherford County and had lived there his entire life. He received Arthur in his home, which was small and neat and smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and he listened to what Arthur had found and what he was looking for. Then he got up, went to a cabinet, and came back with a bundle of documents tied with a faded blue ribbon, setting them on the table. The documents included several pieces of correspondence involving Cornelius Tatum, letters he had written and letters he had received. Ledbetter had obtained them, he explained, from Dorinda Tatum's daughter, who had found them among her mother's effects after Dorinda died in 1891. Arthur read through them carefully, there at Ledbetter's table, the old man watching him from across the room. The picture that emerged was not simple, and it did not resolve into the shape that Arthur had been expecting. He had been constructing, over the months of his investigation, a narrative with a clear architecture, a man locked in a cabin, a cruel and arbitrary act of confinement, a secret maintained by a community complicit in its perpetuation. What the letters showed him was something more complicated. Though not, ultimately, less damning, Amos Jaybird had, according to a letter Cornelius received in 1856 from a man in Murfreesboro named Thaddeus Creel, been involved in what Creel described as communications of a dangerous nature with a free-colored population in Nashville. Creel was, as best Arthur could determine from context, some kind of informal liaison between local property owners and the county's law enforcement apparatus. The kind of man whose precise role it never quite officially articulated, but who everyone understands performs a function in maintaining the order of things. The communications Creel referred to were, reading between the lines of his careful language, connected to the broader network of correspondence and mutual assistance that enslaved and freed black people in the South maintained as a form of resistance and survival. Amos Jaybird, it appeared, had been writing or sending word by other means, since literacy was dangerous and often illegal, to people beyond the Tatum property. He had been in contact with people in Nashville. He had, Creel wrote, made himself a problem that requires a solution before it becomes a larger one. Cornelius Tatum's response to this letter, a draft of which was in the bundle Ledbetter had preserved, was measured and careful. He wrote that he understood the concern, that he would manage the matter privately, that there was no need to involve the county's formal structures, which would create records and attention that served no one's interests. He would handle it himself. Handling it himself meant the east cabin. It meant the thick walls and the high window, and the lock from the outside. It meant removing Amos Jaybird from the visibility of the other enslaved people on the property, from the visibility of neighbors and travelers and county assessors, and placing him in a state of enforced invisibility from which Cornelius clearly calculated the problem he represented would simply stop existing. Arthur understood that this was not an unusual calculation for its time and place. That is part of what makes it so difficult to look at directly. It was a form of control that existed within the broad tolerance of a social system that had decided certain things were not crimes and certain people were not victims. Cornelius Tatum did not lock Amos Jaybird in that cabin because he was uniquely cruel. He did it because the system in which he operated made it possible, and the community around him made it acceptable, and no one in a position to object had sufficient power to do so. What happened in that cabin over the 16 to 18 months that the counting marks suggest, the documents do not say. Hester Gaines's 1866 claim suggests that Amos was alive when the war ended, or at least that she did not know he was dead. The disoriented figure in Solomon Gentry's account, the man who walked out of the Eastern Wood in January 1863 and could not fit his answers to the questions asked of him, may or may not have been Amos. If it was, then the chaos of the Battle of Stones River, with Union troops moving through and Confederate lines disrupted, had temporarily collapsed the entire social architecture of the county, providing the only opening that the locked door could not withstand. Not force, not rescue, but the temporary collapse of the system that maintained it. Arthur found one more document in Ledbetter's bundle. It was not a letter. It was a half-page of notes in Cornelius Tatum's handwriting that appeared to have been written sometime in 1863, after the battle. The notes were fragmentary, not a letter, not a journal entry, more like a man working through something on paper. Several lines were crossed out. What remained legible was this: the cabin is to remain as it is. Nothing moved, nothing changed. The door is to stay locked. If anyone asks, the cabin is for storage. If the property is sold, the arrangement is to continue. This is not negotiable, if it ever becomes necessary to explain. Though God willing it will not. The explanation is that the situation is settled and the matter is closed. The man is gone. Where he went is not known and should not be inquired after. Arthur sat with that half-page for a long time. The man is gone. Where he went is not known. Cornelius had written those words in 1863, in the weeks after whatever had happened during the battle's chaos, and he had apparently never revised them. He had accepted not knowing as the resolution. He had closed the door, locked it, and passed the instruction along through deeds and social pressure and the quiet collective agreement of a community that understood without needing to discuss it explicitly that some questions are better not pursued, and he had counted on the architecture of that agreement to hold. It had held for 40 years. It had held through 4 property sales and multiple generations of county residents, and a war that was supposed to have changed everything. It had held until a bookkeeper from Cincinnati, with no history in that county, and no investment in its silences, arrived with a cold chisel and too many questions. Arthur Pemberton went back to his property that evening. He walked out to the east cabin in the April dusk, the trees around the edge of the property just beginning to come back into leaf. He stood in the doorway and looked at the marks on the wall, some 500 days' worth of marks, made by a man who had needed to know that time was passing, that he still existed inside it. He stood there until it was fully dark, then went back to the house. Arthur Pemberton did not publish what he had found. He was not a journalist or a historian. He was a bookkeeper who had bought a farm and stumbled into a record of something that his country had decided to bury. He wrote up his findings in a careful document, 23 pages, organized the way a bookkeeper organizes things, with sources noted and gaps clearly marked. He sent copies to 3 places: the Freedmen's Bureau Records Office in Nashville, now essentially a historical archive; the Howard University Library in Washington, which had expressed interest in documentation of the post-war period; and a black-owned newspaper in Nashville that he had learned of through the AM church contacts he'd made during his research. He received one response, a brief acknowledgement from the Nashville newspaper, thanking him for the documentation and noting that it would be added to their collection of records concerning the treatment of formerly enslaved people in Middle Tennessee. Whether anything was published, Arthur never confirmed. He did not receive a copy of any article. He was not contacted further. He and Catherine had a conversation in the late spring of 1904 about whether to stay on the property. Catherine said she had thought about it a great deal, and that she did not think leaving would accomplish anything. That whatever had happened there had happened, and the land was the land, and running from it did not seem to her like the right response. Arthur agreed, though he noted that he had lost considerable enthusiasm for farming in general, and that the property's main appeal, its price, its mystery, had resolved itself in a way he hadn't anticipated. They stayed for 6 more years. Arthur never fully reconciled himself to the property's history in the way that Catherine seemed to. He walked past the east cabin every day, and what he felt, he wrote in a letter to his brother in 1907, was not fear, not anything supernatural or irrational, but a kind of grief he couldn't quite locate. Not for someone he had known, for the fact of it, for the normalcy of it, for the 40 years of silence that had required no conspiracy, no dramatic enforcement, just the quiet agreement of people who had decided that their comfort was worth more than someone else's existence. He wrote, "The worst thing I found in that cabin was not the marks. The worst thing was how easy it was. Nobody had to force anyone to keep quiet. They just did, generation after generation, because keeping quiet was easier than not keeping quiet. I think about that a great deal." The property was sold in 1910. The deed did not contain the clause about the east cabin. Arthur removed it. He also removed the boards from the window before they left, so that light could come through. He was not sure why this felt important. It just did. What became of Amos Jaybird is not known. The historical record, for all of Arthur Pemberton's searching, did not yield an answer to that question. There is no death record. There is no Freedmen's Bureau record. There is Hester Gaines's 1866 notation. Someone should look for him, and then silence. It is possible that he survived. It is possible that he built a life somewhere outside the reach of Rutherford County's records. It is possible that he lived for decades after walking out of that cabin, if it was him who walked out. that he found his way to people who could help him, and that his story continued in directions that left no paper trail for a Cincinnati bookkeeper to follow 30 years later. It is also possible that it went the other way. The documents don't say. What the documents do say, clearly, if you're willing to read them, is that a community of ordinary people, none of them monsters in any dramatic sense, maintained a silence for 40 years that made one man's suffering nobody's problem and nobody's business. They maintained it through property transactions and social pressure and the simple, devastating power of collective agreement. And when the silence was finally broken, it was broken by an outsider, someone who hadn't been taught to look away, wielding nothing more dramatic than a cold chisel and the assumption that questions deserve answers. The East Cabin stood on the property until at least 1923, when county records show it was demolished. The main house was renovated several times over the following decades. The land is farmland today, driven past by people who don't know its name. But the marks are gone now. They were in a cabin that no longer exists. The only record of them is in Arthur Pemberton's 23-page document, which sits in the Howard University Library, cataloged under Property Records and Personal Accounts, Middle Tennessee, 1900 to 1910, where it has been for over a century, waiting as records do for someone to look. This mystery shows us something that history returns to again and again. That cruelty does not require monsters. It requires ordinary people making ordinary decisions about what to see and what to look away from, and agreeing, without ever quite having to say so aloud, that some doors are better left closed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are parts of this that no record could ever fully capture? Leave your comment below. If this story stayed with you the way we hope it did, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear stories that history tried to forget. We'll see you in the next one.